Hello, YouTube. Today we're going to be talking about the different classes of LOTRO, how they play, and what the community or other players expect of you when you play a certain class. So for example, if a class can tank, does everyone immediately want you to tank? And if you just said, no, I'd rather DPS, do they just kind of kick you or look to replace you kind of thing? This was a video or a request made by you guys, and I thought it was a great idea, a nice clear video to kind of explain the classes and what to expect. So this video is more focused on new players in the game who have maybe played MMOs like World of Warcraft and are trying to understand the similarities between the classes, or maybe you just have no idea whatsoever and this is kind of your first introduction to MMOs, or maybe you've played a couple of classes but you still don't understand the rest of them that much. So yeah, that's who the video is made for. Everything that is discussed in this video does work for both legendary and the normal servers. I know most of my content does focus on the legendary server aspect, so that is a driving force behind it, but it does still translate to the normal servers just as well. But a bit of context before we get started for the newer players is in LOTRO, there's different group sizes depending on the dungeons that you're doing. So there's 3-man dungeons, 6-man dungeons, and 12-man raids. There is some exceptions outside of that, but we're not going to talk about those. That is generally the main sizes of the dungeons. So classes that utilize the group-wide buffs or AoE healings, like healing abilities and stuff, will generally only affect your group. So in a 3-man or 6-man, that's everyone including yourself. But if it's in a 12-man raid scenario, these skills will only affect your group of 6, right? So for a 12-man raid, there's group 1 and group 2. Each group has 6 people. So your so-called like group buffs or party buffs or healing abilities will only affect your group or like the 6 closest people kind of thing. There are some exceptions to this, which is why some classes will excel in different scenarios. So that is something that I just wanted to discuss quickly and share, so that you can understand that sometimes when I say, oh, this class is AoE healing, in a raid scenario, it's only going to heal their group. But with some other classes that we'll get into, I'll specify that this spell works for everybody in the raid. And then also I wanted to discuss quickly that generally classes have 3 different specs. There's a blue, a red, and a yellow line. The blue line is generally healing or tank, depending on the class. Red line is always the damage spec. And then the yellow line is either the support role, the tank role, or the healing role, again, depending on the class. There are a couple of exceptions to this, which is the yellow line isn't technically its own spec. It's a universal tree. And what this means is that both the remaining tank and damage spec have access to this tree for free or no extra cost. So to help explain that, I wanted to just show you this little example here. So this is just it's just a talent builder online, and I've selected the Guardian class for now, just to show this. So Guardian has a tank line and a red line. This yellow line isn't actually a spec that you can go into. It's both when you have either, if you're DPS or tank, you can spend points into this tree for no extra cost. So at level 150, you have a total of 98 points available to you to spend. When you select a spec, so I have the DPS tree selected right now, any points you spend for your selected spec will cost 1 point. Right? So I spend 1 point. It's a 1-to-1 ratio. Spend 5 points. Points spent 5. Available points 93. But if I, as DPS or as red line, if I wanted to go into my blue tank line, it would cost me 2 points per talent. So if I wanted to spend 1 point, it's actually spending 92. See, I only have 5, 1, so 6 talent points or 6 talents selected, but I actually have 7 points spent. So if I do it again, 91, I spend 1 point. I actually spent 2 because I went from 91 to 89. Went from 7 points spent to 9 points spent, right? Because this tree is not part of my selected spec. And it would be vice versa if I was tank, right? So if I was tank line and I went into DPS, it would cost me 2 points. But the universal tree acts as a way to spend points at no extra cost. So I spend 1 point, it only costs me 1 point, right? I'm at 88, 87, 86, 85, 84. So that's the benefit of the universal tree with the classes that have only 2 specs. So there'll be a couple of them that share this universal tree, and that's the point of this universal tree. So basically what it's trying to do is that both tank and DPS have access to extra skills, and it makes their class stand out more in different scenarios compared to the other classes, which we'll get into when the time comes. So with all that out of the way, let's get into the classes. We're just going to kind of work alphabetically here down the character or class list here, starting with the Beorning or the Bear. The Bear is your druid fantasy class of the game, right? There's druids in D&D, in World of Warcraft. It is the classic human turns into an animal. In Lord of the Rings Online, you can only turn into a bear. So there's no like swimming or flying forms. There's no cat form. It's purely just a bear. And that's just the way it is for lore purposes to fit into Middle-earth. So the bear uses what's called wrath. It's no different than like energy or rage or fury, right? It's just their resource. You build up the wrath and then you spend it on, generally in your bear form, you have your higher hitting skills to spend that wrath. The bear form itself doesn't cost any wrath. It acts more as like a toggle skill, right? You hit the skill and now you're just sitting as a bear. You untoggle it, now you're just sitting in a human form. The bear can heal, tank, or DPS. The tank is based around sitting in bear form and soaking as much damage as possible, keeping a stacking armor buff on yourself, and having a stacking AoE armor shred type debuff on enemies in front of you. They have some decent defensives and self-healing to keep yourself alive, but as the tank class for the bear, you're generally just super beefy with a massive health pool compared to most of the other tanks. As a DPS bear, the red line, you utilize both the human form and bear form. So you have some skills in human form that you apply some dots and debuffs, building up that wrath, and then you would switch over to your bear form, apply some more bleeds, some more dots, some more debuffs, and then you consume all of your wrath to use kind of like your execute hard-hitting skills, and then you'd switch back to human form and reapply your dots, build up their wrath, rinse and repeat. Healing bear is also very similar. Their yellow line, where they use both human and bear form. You use some damaging skills and some small heals to build up that wrath, and then you spend it all on your bigger heals while you're in either bear or healing. Bear healing is one of those unique situations where they have raid-wide healing. right? So we discussed earlier where some AoE healing abilities will only affect your group of 6 in a raid, but a bear healing can their skills affect all 12 members of the raid, and that's what makes them really unique and stand out in raid scenarios. It's one of the things that makes them really strong. But that being said, all bear specs are very strong in any role that they play. Their tank role is really good. They do really good damage. It might be one of the highest, if not the highest, like probably like top 5, top 3. And their healing is just really good because of that raid-wide healing. So there isn't necessarily an expectation when it comes to what you should play when you select bear as your chosen class. Just there could be scenarios where you are encouraged to heal because your heals are just that good. But like I said, every role is super strong, so there isn't really an expectation. There's just more encouragement in some scenarios. All right, moving on to the Burglar. Burglars are your classic rogue character using stealth to essentially one-shot enemies, right? And then if you don't one-shot them, or there's multiple enemies around, you have a lot of stuns and CCs to control targets, get behind them, deal that positional like backstab type damage, and that's generally how they play. Their skills are built around what's called crit chain. So every time you get a crit, a new skill becomes available. Then when you use that skill, a second skill then becomes available. You kind of rinse and repeat that. So it's built around very high burst and just quick damage, right? You want that crit so that you can use your crit chain and then use your crit chain response skill and just kind of chain those. That kind of generally becomes your rotation. So Burgs have 2 different DPS specs and 1 support spec. So one DPS spec is built around the classic, stealth, sneaking around, get behind the target, backstab, boom. Hopefully they kind of die in that one ability type thing, it's really good for soloing, questing, PvP, that kind of a thing. Where their other DPS spec is built more around doing damage outside of stealth, right? So in a dungeon or raid scenario, you can't go into stealth constantly throughout the fight, so it's trying to act more as that a bleed focus spec so that you can just keep doing damage consistently rather than going into stealth and getting that high burst damage. However, over time, these 2 specs have kind of fallen behind in damage when compared to other classes in a raid scenario. So they are looking to do a rework to try to make these DPS specs stronger and encourage players to play them more. Because right now, their support role is essentially a must-have in any raid scenario and more group scenarios, especially even more so on the legendary servers with how much they keep changing and retuning all of the dungeons. So their support role uses all these debuffs where they reduce enemy damage, make them attack slower, making them take increased damage from your party. They have lots of CC and stuns. They have some group-wide heals and small buffs. So because of how strong all of their debuffs are, it's almost required to have one, right? And that's why they're kind of getting a rework to try to help encourage more reasoning behind using their damage rolls. But because their damage rolls just aren't as good, the support role outshines. So when you do play a burglar in a group or raid scenario, you are encouraged and kind of expected to just play the support role. Moving on to Brawler. Brawler is kind of LOTRO's monk class, right? You're punching, dealing quick bursts of damage, and you're a more damage focused tank. So they do have a tank and a damage roll, and they are the first class that we're going to talk about where they only have 2 specs, using that third one, that yellow line, as their universal role. So their resource is just called Metal, which is essentially just a 9-point energy bar. So some skills will cost 5 energy, some will cost 7, some will cost 9, and just the more you spend, the more damage that you do, essentially. Both their damage and their tank roll are more focused on kind of like a 1v1 scenario, and then the more targets that are around them, they start to lose a little bit of value. So as a tank roll, they can feel really strong and really hard to kill in that just single target boss fight, and you have lots of self-healing, and you have some buffs that you can give to the party, you know, when things kind of get a little bit spicy or something goes wrong, kind of thing. But as soon as more targets start appearing, then all of a sudden you notice that you feel a little bit more squishy than you did in that one-on-one scenario. And that's where you start using your abilities more on defensive things rather than offensive abilities. Then in their DPS role, strong single target damage, building that metal and spending it on their like the execute or high hitting abilities. They just have very little AoE. So again, in that multi-target scenario, that's where they start to lose a little bit of value, as they just don't have as much AoE as other classes. But to make up for that, what they have is small party buffs where you're increasing people's damage, or debuffs where you're reducing the enemy's armor, stuff like that. You also have small bits of healing, so they kind of just have a bit of a support role that's mixed in with their damage roll. So now going into their universal line, their yellow line, essentially what it just allows is that both the tank and the DPS role have access to more group buffs, more group healing, and kind of random things like faster movement speed, or now you have additional effects to food, like just minor things like that. But yeah, so that's the Brawler. There is no real expectation in terms of, oh, you joined a group, you should tank. Oh, you joined a group, you should heal, or do damage. They're both solid. They're both really good. They're just one of the... You don't see Brawlers a lot, so Brawlers are kind of fun to see in your group, and it's always exciting to see what they're capable of doing. There is no real expectation on which role you should play when you're in a group, though. Captain. Moving on to Captain, which is kind of your... It's basically your Paladin class, right? It's this heavy armor tank that even in their DPS role, they're still really tanky. They have a lot of burst damage while also supplying kind of like some party buffs, right? As classic Paladins kind of do, with buffs and like off healing, that kind of a thing. And they can feel very unkillable when they're in the tank role. So captains use a lot of buffs that work on the group or the entire raid. They're one of 2 classes that uses the, it's called Motivate, which is just a simple flat 5% increase to health for everyone. So this is the entire raid. This is your entire group, which is just nice to have, right? There's nothing wrong with a free 5% increased health. It's basically a necessity for any raid scenario. They also have what's called a Blade Brother or a Song Brother. The name just changes depending on your spec, but it's a toggle skill that you put on one ally, and that ally will receive specific buffs based on some skills that you use, where everyone else in your group of 6, including yourself, will get a lesser version of that buff. So you've picked a DPS class to be your Blade Brother. Now, when you hit a certain skill, that Blade Brother will get a 10% damage buff for a few seconds, but everyone else in the group will only get a 5% damage buff for a few seconds, as just a quick little example. The same thing works when you're in tank lines. So it's where if you give, basically when you give your tank, your other tank in the group or in the raid, or your healer, you can give them some healing and defensive kind of things, and then everyone else in the group will get a lesser effect of that. So that's just kind of how that Blade Brother or Song Brother mechanic works. So they do have 3 specs. They have the tank, heals, and DPS spec. Their heal spec is really fun in that it fits that as a healer, you're dealing more damage than any other healer while also doing some heals, but they don't have the same healing output as other healers in the game. So you're generally not going to see or use a healing captain in a raid or really group scenarios as the main healer. There are some niche situations where that can happen. There is some exceptions depending on the specific dungeon, 3-man versus 6-man, the group makeup. But generally speaking, because their healing output is so low and it's more focused on just lower HOTS over time, you're not going to be the main healer of a raid as a healing captain. Hopefully, though, this does change in the future, because there has been some moments in the past where they are really strong healing and they're just a lot of fun. But we'll have to see how that changes. Their DPS spec is super important, and it's built around a simple rotation of just skill A buff skills B, and then you use skill B, which then buffs skill C, and then so on and so forth, and then you kind of just repeat that rotation. And they've got a mixture of bleeds with just some kind of burst damage built around buff A or skill A buff skill B. But then they're also one of the 3 classes, technically 2, but we'll get into that later with that specific class, that essentially has WoW's in World of Warcraft, you have heroism or lust. LOTRO's version is essentially just a massive incoming damage debuff that you apply onto one target. So the captains have Oathbreakers. And what this does is it's a debuff that lasts 15 seconds, where the target you've chosen now takes 35% more damage. So 15 seconds, 35% more damage, and it's just on a 3-minute cooldown. So it's a massive just like DPS burst window, right, for the entire raid or dungeon. Because it's not a buff that you put on your group, it's a debuff that you put on the enemy, so everyone benefits from it. And you know, you use it to like get through a DPS race type thing. Use it at the start of a fight where everyone has their cooldowns, and then you can use it again throughout the later fight. What makes it really good is that it's the highest incoming damage debuff, where the other classes have lesser versions of it that do other things. But the whole idea is that once this ability is used, the enemy that you used it on gets a debuff, or I guess you could call it more of a buff, where for 1.5 minutes, a similar skill of that massive incoming damage cannot be used on it. So the whole idea is that let's say you start with a captain, you use Oathbreakers, and then after 1.5 minutes, you use the next class's skill or a second captain, and then you kind of repeat it and rotate it through the different classes, so that essentially you're trying to always get this damage, incoming damage debuff every 1.5 minutes kind of thing. Moving on to their tank role. Their tank role is very strong. You will feel very unkillable. They have so much self-healing and buffs that just help them have a large health pool. They shine a lot in 3-man dungeons, as it's very often where you feel like you don't even necessarily need a healer, or you need less heals because you have so much self-healing. So that is where they shine, but you can still play them in any group or raid scenario because they're just really strong tanks. Overall, there's never a role that you're expected to play over the other. Aside from you're not expected to play healer, you will be expected to play DPS or tank more. But both the DPS role, because of Oathbreakers, and the tank role being so strong, you'll never go wrong with whichever one you play. All right, moving on to champion. Champions are kind of unique class, in that some would think they're kind of like the fighter or warrior class, but they aren't quite that because of just how their different specs work. So champion, they do have their crazy AoE damage spec and a crazy single target damage spec. They also have a tank spec, but their whole class is built around this what's called fervor, which is just a 5-point energy system where, once again, your higher hitting abilities will cost more fervor. But let's say you use a skill that costs 3, but when you use the skill, you actually have 5 fervor. Then what happens is the skill now does extra damage per extra point consumed. So for just an example, you have a skill that costs 3, you're using it at 5. So because there's 2 extra points used to use on the skill, then you're doing an extra 2%, let's say, per point consumed. Their tank spec can feel undertuned in compared to other tank classes. It's hard to use, and really what it is it just requires a lot of game and class knowledge and understanding when certain mechanics are happening so you can help prepare for it. They're meant to be a higher damaging tank role, so you're a little bit squishier, but you're dealing a lot more damage than any other tank. But the Brawler has ended up fitting that role much better, and it's also easier because Brawlers are just slightly tankier, especially in that 1v1 scenario. So because of how the champion tank works, it's not something that I would even recommend playing, and you're never expected to tank as a champion, just because the general amount of players or the community know that the tank role just isn't great for champion, and they would much rather you do damage. So if you're a tank player, I would not recommend the champion. I would recommend a different class. So let's talk about their 2 DPS roles. Their yellow line is AoE focused, and that's just what it is. It's built around doing the most amount of damage to as many targets as possible. Basically every 10 to 15 seconds, you're hitting all of your buttons, and everything around you just kind of falls over. It's very simple and it's very fun. The other DPS spec is single target focused, so they're red line, and it's just around, again, you build up your fervor, you then spend it on all of your highest hitting skills. It's very fast, it's very consistent damage. You could say that it feels maybe a little bit like a Fury Warrior from Warcraft, where you are constantly just hitting your buttons. There's no downtime. There's always something to do, so it can feel very exciting. And there's very little cooldowns that you're kind of waiting for. You're just always putting out damage, and that's what I think is very, very fun about it. All right, moving on to the Guardian now. This is your classic warrior or fighter class. It's just your class, like, come at me, I will come at me, bro. I'm not gonna die. I got my sword, got my shield, or I got my two-handed kill everything. You're just your classic warrior or fighter. Guardians use what's called the parry or block response chains. So when you block or parry, a new skill opens up. And then when you use that skill, a new skill opens up, and so on and so forth. So you kind of start with like fewer buttons or fewer abilities to work with at the start. But then as the fight continues, you kind of gain access to more buttons and more abilities to use. So the tank spec is very strong. It's very simple. Lots of reactive defensives. So when you first get low, you have a defensive to use, and then the second time you get low, you have another defensive, and the third time, and the fourth time, so on and so forth. But eventually, then by that point, the first one has come back up. So it's some might say that it's not a very engaging spec because of its simplicity of just stand there, wait for your block or parry responses to happen, then use those skills. As you get low, you have different defensives to use, and it's kind of just a stand there and take damage. But that's what makes them so strong, is that they're simple, easy to use, very easy to understand and pick up. They're very accessible, and I think that's just why they become a very popular tank class, and because they're very good in their role. Their DPS spec is built around maintaining a few bleeds, both single target and AoE bleeds, but mostly single target damage focused. And then they use their parry response chains to gain access to high burst damage. But instead of where your DPS, you're not going to be, in theory, you're not going to be taking damage. So if you're not taking damage, how do you get those parry responses to work? So their DPS line has access to a couple of skills that essentially force a parry response chain, and they're on a very short cooldown, so that you're kind of just always in the flow of combat of, okay, so you put on your bleeds, you now force a parry response, and then you start that chain of unlocking new abilities. They're very strong in solo play and 3-man and 6-man dungeon scenarios. They can do fine damage in a raid scenario as well, but generally speaking, because their damage isn't as good as other DPS classes like the champion, you are encouraged more to tank just because it's very safe and it's very easy. I would not pick the Guardian if you're looking at, I want to play a DPS role. I would pick the Guardian if you're looking at wanting to tank but want a very solid DPS role for solo play or for some small group play. Also, their DPS role is very good in PvP because of just how their skill rotation works. So if that's something that interests you, that's something to keep in mind. Like Brawlers, the Guardian does not have the third spec. They just have the universal trait line with their yellow line. So what this does is it gives new ways to creating parry or block responses. It gives you more armor, it gives you more debuffs, gives you more damage. So, and you're now making enemies attack slower. You get a variety of small buffs to your damage or your crit chance or your resist ratings, your armor, all that kind of stuff. So it just makes the Guardian stand out more in unique ways, where a captain has self-healing, but they don't really have any way to debuff the enemy as much or deal more damage. But a Guardian has all of these defensives and also can just give themselves more buffs or do more damage, or also debuff the enemy. And that also translates to the whatchamacallit, their DPS line, where in DPS you now also have access to all of these extra debuffs for the enemy and buffs on yourself. So that's where they try to shine and stand out, and it's why they have a little bit more value in maybe a small group or a PvP scenario, but in a raid you are generally just going to be asked to tank, just because there's other classes that will just do more damage than you will. All right, moving on to the Hunter. The Hunter is just your classic ranged bow class, right? It is getting reworked very soon, so I'm not going to go too much into it, but the idea is that they have 3 specs. They're all damage related for the most part, and they use what's called focus. So you build focus by using your smaller builder type skills, and then you spend it on your higher hitting skills. The more focus that you use, the more damage you're doing, essentially. So one spec is the standard stay put. You're planted, you're not moving, you're at a very far range, and as long as you're not moving constantly, you're going to do a lot of damage. Then you have another spec, which is built around attacking while moving. Now your range is not as far, but you can now deal with like raid and dungeon mechanics much easier, or kite enemies, because you can do a lot of consistent damage while on the move. The third is based more around around debuffs, while also doing damage. It tries to sit in that trapper aspect of like a hunter or a ranger class fantasy. You're placing traps on the ground. You've got some slows, some CC. You're putting bleeds and debuffs on the target, like lowering armor. So they have their moments in some raid scenarios that way, but overall they're not really strong right now, and this is why they're being reworked. And we know that they're trying to keep with we got a debuff roll, a stand and plant, and a moving a lot roll with their specs. That's still going to stay when they get reworked. We just don't know how they're going to feel or how well they're going to do with that rework. And that rework is coming very soon, so that's why I didn't want to get too much into it. All right, moving on to the Lore Master. Lore Master is your classic like mage wizard role, but it's also your pet class. But then they also have a massive support role as well. So they're kind of unique in that way, and each spec plays very differently. There really isn't like a class-specific mechanic that's unique to them per se when compared to other classes. One DPS spec uses pets. You summon a pet, you command the pet, make it use its abilities to deal damage, debuff the enemy, apply bleeds, buff your skills, buff your allies, and then you're basically just dismissing a pet and summoning a new one, so you use its abilities, and you're rinse and repeating. So you have this one spec that your rotation is just basically built around summoning your pet, using its abilities, and then dismissing it, and going on to your next pet. That spec also has access to the increase enemies' incoming damage, very much like the captain, where this buff or debuff is 25% instead of 35% incoming damage, but it's also a bleed, so this skill itself does damage, and it also applies a 5% mischance on the enemy. However, because this DPS spec with the pet summoning doesn't actually have a lot of damage output, and it isn't as strong as the other DPS roles out there, or even the Lore Master's its own other DPS spec, it's not used or required as much. It's good in PvP, but again, because it's like incoming damage debuff skill that it uses isn't as strong. Like it's a 10% difference between the lore master skill and the captain skill. People would rather just have a captain fill that role. So instead, as a DPS class, you're asked to play your red line, which is solely focused around dealing insane amount of burst damage in AoE and single target scenarios. So their skills have in redline, their skills have a longer cooldown, and you're going to be sitting in a situation where you're spamming a lot of like spamming 2 to 4 abilities, waiting for those longer cooldowns to come up. But when they are up, you're feeling that classic master of the elements. You've got fire abilities, lightning, earthquakes, tornadoes, using you got your fire skills buffing your frost skills. You're summoning Ents and got crazy lightning storms, right? So it's visually, Lore Masters, in my opinion, has some of the coolest looking abilities in the game. And this class, their damage output is just so much higher than their pet damage roll, that it's not necessarily, I wouldn't say it's an expectation in groups. It's just it feels a lot more exciting to play. But if you're into the pet thing, then the spec is fun in small dungeon scenarios and in some open world and questing stuff or PvP scenarios. But none of those specs compare to basically what's required in all group and raid scenarios, which is their third support role spec, which is focused a lot around debuffs to make the target deal less damage, to make the target take increased damage, reduce their armor, their resist rating, they attack slower, all while you're healing your allies and summoning your pets to further debuff the enemy or buff your allies. Because of just the insane amount of debuffs and debuffs, while also having a strong off healer support role, you are 99% of the time you are expected to play this support role as a lore master in 6-man dungeons and in the 12-man raid. Especially on the legendary servers now, with how much overtuning is done, you if you don't have a burglar in the raid or dungeon, then you have to have a yellow lore master, because it's just the dungeon or raid can feel almost impossible to complete without all of those insane debuffs that you're doing. On top of that, Lore Master as a class as a whole is the only other class that does the motivate ability. So, right, we talked about Captain giving the motivate, which is the 5% morale buff. Lore Masters also have that same motivate ability in all 3 specs, but still, it's another reason to just have a yellow Lore Master. Their damage rolls aren't necessarily bad. It's just you have to have that Lore Master support role in order to complete certain dungeons. So you're just going to be expected to play yellow Lore Master. Moving on to Mariner. They're a very unique class in the MMO world. I can't really think of a game that I've played, at least, that matches the Mariner, and they're also the newest class to LOTRO. They're essentially pirates that play kind of around fencing, so advancing on your enemy and then to do a whole bunch of damage and then retreating so that and that's where you kind of buff yourself and your allies, and you will heal a bit before you go back to advancing. So it's like that swashbuckling from Pirates of the Caribbean. They're moving forward, they're moving backwards, they're moving forwards, they're moving backwards, right? So that's kind of the class fantasy there. So how the mechanic works though is that if you are only on the advance or only on the retreat, you no longer have the balance in your movement, so you stumble and fall, or in the game's mechanics, you actually just get stunned for a really long time as punishment for committing too hard one way or the other. But you want to commit a little bit to gain access to more abilities. So as you continue to advance, you'll get stronger hitting skills, or as you continue to retreat, you'll gain access to like stronger debuffs or stronger buffs essentially. But you don't want to go too far, so then you have to switch back to advancing. And so it's a unique play style, and it can kind of get a little bit confusing when you add in the next layer that they have. But they do have 3 specs. A more buffing side one with a little bit of damage, basically essentially a pure damage roll, and then their third one is rather than it's got some buffs, but it's also more meant for debuffs. It's kind of really niche and it isn't used a whole lot, but we'll get into that a little bit when we talk about the different roles. So they do not heal, they do not tank, but their one damage roll is not only do you have the advancing and the retreating, but it also kind of has this mini combo system where you can change your abilities to do more AoE damage or more single target damage. So, for example, combo ABC will make skill D single target. But if you do combo AEF, now skill D is AoE, as just kind of a quick little example. Their buffing spec, their blue line, is just built around increasing allies' damage, increases healing done by the raid, buffing the skills of the healers, making them heal more. But it also has that incoming damage skill where the enemy now takes 25% increased incoming damage. However, once again, it's not as strong as the captain's, but this one has an AoE effect where if you pick one target, it will take 25% incoming damage, but enemies around it will take 10% incoming damage for a few seconds. And their debuff skill lasts longer than the captain's incoming damage debuff skill. So this is where you bring the Mariner as that secondary class to help rotate out the incoming damage debuff skills, and you'll, in a raid scenario, you might be encouraged or asked to play this blue line of the buffing and having the access to that incoming damage debuff skill. But the red line, your damage is one of the highest. I definitely top 3, if not the top damage skill or damaging class overall. So that's why it's not necessarily an expectation to play one over the other. Both are really strong in their own unique ways. So, but moving on to their third spec, it's kind of just a mix of everything. You have a little bit of damage, a little bit of debuffs, a little bit of CC, but because of you just have a little bit of everything, you're not really amazing at everything or at anything in general, and other classes just debuff better or have better CC or will do more damage. So that this role kind of gets put to the side, and that's why it's no, we want you for your buffs, or we want you for your damage. So in your small, even in your small groups, your 3-mans or 6-mans, like, no, we want your damage or your buff roll. We don't want this weird yellow line. But I don't know a whole lot about it, but I also just don't see it a whole lot. So yeah, that's the Mariner. Moving on to Minstrel. This is LOTRO's version of the Bard. You're playing an instrument to buff and heal allies while also dealing some damage. Their class mechanic kind of focuses around maintaining a bunch of healing or damaging buffs. So you're playing your instrument, you're starting your song, and then you kind of, as you build up or continue playing your song, then kind of consume or cash out on those buffs that you've built to then use a stronger hitting skill or a stronger heal kind of thing, and then you go back to maintaining those buffs again. So minstrels have 2 classes. They have 2 specs. They have healing and a DPS spec, with their third being that universal spec once again. So their healing is more proactive. It's that classic, like, single target focused. You see an ally low on health, you hit your healing button. Then as you heal more, your heals become stronger and stronger. So you start off with weaker ones, you continue to heal or play your music, and your heals become faster, stronger as the tempo of the music builds, kind of thing is the class fantasy there. And the DPS spec works the same, where you have your lower damage building up to insane high sustained damage output while buffing your own damage. So you start off slow, you're building momentum and tempo in your music, and then boom, you've got your high hitting skills. The third spec, what it does is it allows for both healing and DPS, because it's universal, to give more group-wide buffs while buffing some of your own skills in a specific way. Maybe it's making your heals stronger or a certain specific skill hit harder, but the main focus of this universal tree is actually it's the access to a major reset ability where once used, your entire raid, so all 12 members, have their major cooldowns reset. So it's a great thing to use kind of at the tail end of a DPS window to help help DPS kind of continue their highest damage outputs, or it can reset the defensive abilities of all of your tanks, right? So if there's a certain phase in a raid fight or a dungeon fight where the tanks have to use their biggest defensive cooldowns so that they live, but you're pushing into the next phase of the fight, you want to be able to reset those abilities so that now you have access to your tanks have access to their defensive abilities. So that's kind of almost the main purpose of their universal role. There's no expectations on what people expect you to play. Your damage is still good in group play. Your heals are still good in group play. However, other classes are generally asked to heal first, and you're just kind of more of a backup. And that's why in that raid scenario, you have that reset ability, which is basically always expected. Whether you're on the healing side or the damage side, the skill is basically just a must-have in a raid. And sometimes what ends up happening is, here, if we go back to that skill tree setup that we showed. So, switch cameras again here. Boom. I think that worked. Yeah. So this is the minstrel tree. Just for this example, let's pick the red line. So we've just picked red line, which is their damage spec, but we want to get this call to greatness. And especially on the legendary servers, we only have, 47 points. So I'm just gonna pick points at random here, but we'll do this, we'll do this, and we'll do some tactical mastery, extend our anthems, more anthems, those are our buffs. Move down, call to greatness, right? When do we have access to it? Boom. So we've had to spend 37 points just to get down here. And on the legendary servers, we only have 47 points. So now you can either finish spending your 10 points in yellow, or this is where now, okay, so now you start going into red. You've got 42, 43, 44, 45, 46, 47. Boom, right? So even though we went into red line as our main spec, we actually spent the majority of our points in yellow just so that we could get our Call to Greatness skill, which is our reset ability. Right? So that was just an example of, on the legendary servers, you may be expected to bring this skill into raid, but in order to get that skill, you're spending like 90% of your points, kind of thing. So yeah, that is the Minstrel. Moving on to Runekeeper. Runekeeper is kind of like another sorcerer or mage type role, or could be very similar to the Shaman from Warcraft. You have 2 different damaging specs and 1 healing spec. The Runekeeper is built around what's called attunement, where as you use your healing or damaging skills, you gain attunement in those class of skills, and they further buff that spec or that type of skill. So you want to use bigger healings, then you need more healing attunement. So you need to do your smaller heals, spread your heals around on different allies. Now you have access to your big healing skills that you hold, waiting for kind of the big burst damage kind of thing. You want to do more of your bigger, harder hitting damaging skills. Well, then you need to be in damage attunement. So you need to use your smaller hitting skills, maybe spread some dots around, building up that attunement, and now shortly into the fight, you have all of your harder hitting skills. So now you have access to your big hits. But what's interesting with this attunement is that you have skills that can essentially reset or flip your attunement. So you can go from crazy healing, flip that attunement, and now all of a sudden you're maxed damaging attunement. So now, even though as a healer you have access to a couple of hard hitting damage skills just for fun kind of thing. And on the flip side, if you're in a damaging spec, you can flip your attunement, and now you have access to a quick big heal kind of thing. Now, if you are in your damage roll, and you have that healing access to that big healing skill, it's not as strong as if you were in the healing spec specifically, and vice versa. If you were healing and now you have high damage attunement, that those high damaging skills won't hit as hard as if you were in your damage spec, but it still plays with this fun little aspect of, as you're healing, you can do damage. As you're damaging, you can also do some healing. So one of their damaging specs is focused around fire, their red line. It's very dot focused and very high sustained damage output. Lots of AoE, but also very good single target damage. You apply dots, you let your damage ramp up, build your attunement, and then you spend that attunement on a high single target channel ability, or an ability that will spread your dots to all enemies around one target kind of thing. Their other damaging spec, their yellow line, is built around lightning, and it's very burst focused. So single target quick spam skills build that attunement, and then boom, you've got this big lightning ability that's just high crit, high damage output, very little AoE compared to fire. So it's meant for shorter fights or fights that just require multiple or enemies to die quickly. So a boss that like will summon 1 or 2 adds every 30 to 40 seconds kind of thing. Lightning is really good in that kind of a scenario where you can kill those little adds quickly and then go back to the boss. Their healing spec, their blue line, is one of the strongest, if not the strongest healing class in the game. It's tied around a lot of hots, so you're applying a lot of healing over time on multiple allies, making sure they're healthy for those big hits that could be incoming. But when the big hits do happen, you've now built up your attunement and you now have access to a lot of group-wide skills or even raid-wide skills. If you've played Warcraft, as an example, maybe you'll know of like a shaman's soul link ability, stand in the green circle kind of thing. Runekeeper has a very similar ability where they have a raid-wide bubble, essentially, where they provide a health bubble and on the entire raid as long as you're grouped up nice and tight. They also can place a totem or a rune stone on the ground that acts as a way to a massive damage reduction for the entire raid. So most of the time, you will be expected to heal in raids and in dungeons. Your healing is just so good, and the skills that you have as a runekeeper are so unique to your class that's where it becomes a requirement to almost have at least one runekeeper healing in a raid. However, it does not mean your damage is bad. Your damage is still very good. It's one of the highest tactical classes across the board. Their damage output in fire over a long fight is really good. It's just that the healing is so good and so unique that people might expect you to heal in a raid scenario or in a group scenario. If you're not the healing type of player, then hopefully there's another runekeeper in the raid or the group that can heal, so you can put out your insane damage. But just be prepared for it, that you might be asked to heal a lot because their healing is just that good. All right, moving on to the final class, Warden. Warden is very unique. There isn't anything like it, as far as I'm aware, in any MMO. People like to call it the slot machine class or the combo class because of how they play. Basically, you have 3 skills, and depending on the order in which you hit those skills and how many times you hit them, it changes the output of your 4th skill. So you have a spear skill, a shield skill, and we call it a fist skill. It's just a quick shout ability. You just yell at the target, but it's a picture of a fist, and the game refers to it as your fist gambits, essentially. So right, that's these combos, these gambits that you're building. So for example, if you do spear shield, your 4th skill, your gambit spender skill, will do some damage, but will interrupt the enemy if they're trying to cast a spell. But if you do spear shield fist spear, you now do more damage. Your gambit spender will do more damage and apply a dot. Kind of a way I like to explain the combo system is kind of like a fighting game, like Street Fighter or Mortal Kombat, where AB does something, but then left right AYB does something, BA does something different, right? So the entire Warden class is built around this combo or gambit system, and you have to essentially learn all the different combos or the different gambits, because there's 2 length combos or gambits, but there's 3 length, there's 4 length, there's 5 length gambits or combos. Luckily, though, there is only 2 specs to kind of learn, and they share those combos. They're just stronger or change slightly depending on the spec that you're playing. So DPS is focused around applying a whole bunch of dots that are AoE but also single target, and they try to maintain those dots as much as possible. The tank spec is very damage focused for a tank, where basically you only build threat because of your dots, and you steal the threat that your allies have built and put it on yourself. So you don't have a lot of force taunt abilities. You have a couple, but they're on really long cooldowns, or they have a really short range. So the whole idea is that you're building all of these AoE dots, you're applying self heals, you're applying self buffs, you're applying group heals to kind of gain threat, but also they act as your defensive abilities, because you're actually a medium armored tank, where every other tank is heavy armor. So you will lose health a lot quickly. So you have to kind of plan your heal gambits, your heal combos ahead of time, and try to keep them up. Because if you fall behind, you could just end up like essentially being one shot, and your healers might struggle to keep you up in some scenarios. But when you're really good at it, you essentially feel unkillable, because you've understood the combos or the gambits, and you've understood kind of a rotation for yourself to keep yourself alive. But to talk about the combos and the differences between the specs, for example, shield, spear, shield, spear, shield in DPS will give you a small heal. But in tank, that exact same combo will give you more healing and a massive heal over time. Right? The heal over time will just last longer and heal more. But same goes for a damage combo. So if you did spear, shield, fist, spear, shield in DPS, it's going to give you a high hitting single target ability, but also a dot. But if you did that in tank, it's not going to hit as hard, and the dot won't be as strong. So their third spec, once again, is it's a universal spec that both damage and tank have access to, and the whole point of it is it just gives you more ranged capabilities. It adds more damage to your rotations, allows you to debuff enemies, and it makes your ranged skills hit hard. So another thing that's unique about Wardens is they have javelins, and this allows them to have kind of a ranged spec where they can tank or DPS while on the move consistently. They never have to stay put. They never have to make sure they're next to the enemy. They can do everything while on the move, essentially. So this universal tree just gives them more access to ranged abilities, and makes it so that when you're in your ranged stance for your combos or your gambits, they're stronger or have additional effects. There is no expectations really with the Warden. They're just a very hard class to play, and it just takes time to understand their combos. There's a lot of dots, there's a lot of hots, and there's just a lot of overall buffs to keep track of. But players who play the Warden well can tank and DPS just fine. They're just a very unique class, and they take a lot of practice and building that muscle memory kind of thing, where other classes don't experience that. Some people really like that about the Warden. Other people don't. It sends them away, because you don't get to see all of your abilities on your skill bars. Essentially, you only see like half the amount of other classes do, because all of your skills are built into your gambit, right? So depending on the combo that you hit, your fourth skill will change into a different ability. You just have to remember the combos. The other thing that's kind of unique and quite frankly funny with the Warden as compared to other classes. Sorry. Wardens are one of the only classes that essentially want every stat in the game. They want every piece of gear because their damage is every type of damage. So a champion will do physical damage because they have a sword and they're just hitting an enemy over and over, so it's a physical damage type. A lore master or a rune keeper will do tactical damage because it's using lightning or fire, and it's a tactical damage type. But a warden uses both all the time, whether they're tanking or DPS, because they have their main weapon, they have their javelins, so there's their physical damage type. But because they have their fist gambits or their yelling, they also do a lot of tactical damage. So because of this, and also tactical damage is how the tank warden actually gets a lot of their threat and hold aggro in boss fights. So essentially, when you're going for gear, you will be fighting every single class in the game for loot, no matter what it is, because all of it is always useful to warden. Usually in an MMO, it's very clear what piece of gear goes to what class. You're like, oh, this piece of gear has this stat, so it goes to this class, or these couple of classes, no one else. Warden is just the class that says, well, technically, I need it because I do everything. So it's just a little fun thing with the Warden. But there we go. This was definitely a longer video. There was a lot to go through, but I really wanted to try to break it down for everyone and try to make it clear, not too confusing, and keep it simple for you new players. But there's a lot of classes, so there's a lot to go through. But thank you for this recommendation for the one that recommended it. I think it's a great idea. Hopefully you did find this helpful. Yeah, and I get next up for the channel. We still have a couple more class guides coming out. I still don't know about those dungeon guides on the legendary servers. There's a couple I can do, I think. But there's still some out there. I'm like, this is incredibly overtuned, and to make it really simple and break it down for you guys, especially you new players, it's really complicated. So I'm hoping that some more changes are done so I can just make it nice and clear and simple and easy to understand for you guys. But yeah, thanks for coming. Hopefully you found this helpful, and I will see you in the next video. Bye-bye.